Hey guys, I'm just coming here to talk about. I want to first establish that I'm trying to do this more frequently. So, I don't know. I don't want to say I'm committing to an everyday thing, but I like to commit to at least every other day, if not every day, where I'm doing essentially like what this is called blasts, where I'm just like these blasts are gonna be me communicating just what I've been like processing and what I'm sort of doing and where I'm at with things, my thoughts on stuff, and it'll be a various amount of topics and whatnot, but really just getting into it for the sake uh, of committing to this muscle, building this muscle of putting out information and making videos and whatnot. And I really wanted to do this anyway in the long run. And so getting the opportunity to do this now in this context, might as well take advantage of it, right? Anyway, with that being said, what I really wanted to get into and I want to talk about today was more about some of my discoveries with the math and what had led me down this path of what I was trying to do and sort of facilitating the overarching idea of what kind of overhaul this will be in the world and why it was so important to me as to how I went about this. And more importantly, I wanted to just get into it. The discovery made is that uh, was started with something I read, was just called the CTMU by written by Christopher Langan. If you can read it, I recommend it. It gives an idea of something called reality theory, which he talks about. The gist of it that I took away from it that really was, which was pivotal in some of my research, was the idea of state to syntax instantiation, which I think is the right way to pronounce that, which is the idea that the being of a property or an object is needs information to communicate that, like DNA, right? And that DNA is communicated from the idea of the DNA in its communication is simultaneous. So the fact that the state of a being is exactly translated into its state exactly as the components are compiled together. So there's no process, there's no lag time in between. They are instant. They are required to for one to be the other, and for the other to be the manifestation of the other. And what that means for information theory as a whole. And then I thought about what that would mean for how do we translate that into our language models and like software, but even more so into redesigning the fabric of how we approach all kinds of transformations of energy, which is information, because everything is information. Numbers are information, and they're not just information and as to like locations that we see, that they are all like, like a number line from 1 to 9, including 0, would be, you would think is it's not just static locations of now there's three now there's 3 here, now there's 4 here. They're not just like qualifiable. Quantifiable. They're qualifiable statements of communication beyond just amount, and that's why you start deducing roles between what is 0 doing, what is 1 really, what is 2, what is a prime number, why primes function this way, what are composites and primes relationships. And that was what I started in the idea of pure math and how it got me down this rabbit hole, how I came to pull these things apart. And I started seeing relationships that work not just in these sort of static little principles, but I began to see meta principles that govern our entire reality, that are universal principles. And so you begin to see all these things, and then that tells you have now the manual of how to, manipulate aspects of reality for the service of the same way you understand how flavors work in a recipe, for it to make better concoctions and composing different meals, and that's what we're here to do, to understand that. And all of that I relate to a bigger cosmic entity that is, the designer. It's like it becomes more and more impossible to say it's anything else, but that's not really my focus of this conversation. The focus of this conversation is what I'm doing with it and what I see as the next moves that will better impact this and my concerns about that. So I realized in the software you can simulate this process of state to syntax by understanding how energy is transferred. So you reduce the need for brute forcing completely by creating deterministic aspects that information is carried. So instead of having to go through the process of, for one, understanding information, and 2, translating that into a state or property, the two become tethered. And the reason why this is possible in our reality is when you look at something like quantum entanglement, where both of these things are communicating themselves to each other simultaneously. And then a lot of tests were done for the ideas of trying to differentiate something that's called localism and realism, which I won't make this about that. I would recommend going and looking those up themselves. But the thing is, people were not sure which one because they both contradict each other. And the first meta principle I will say is that a state of or being or process or property cannot exist in reality without having its contradictory state exist also. You'd have to have what's called a spectrum between them for it to exist at all. And we see the spectrum of opposites exist in every single case and stance, even down to our biology level. Like if you look at our cells, there's something called phospholipid bilayers, which essentially is you have one layer that is hydrophobic and one layer that's hydrophilic. Essentially one layer that is against hydro, which is water, and one layer that's for it. And this is to create a barrier, sort of like a magnetism that one is attracting and repelling the same substance, but they both are fulfilling that role simultaneously and together. And this is a manifest state of equilibrium for communication of information. The same way our neurons in our brain communicate information, we have a contradictory states in our brain, like electric communication styles, like our ions, and then you have chemical communication styles for the synapses, and for these is how information is transmuted from one synaptic state to the other, in processes called like retrograde and anterograde, and there's a lot of that is. So you get to see these patterns show up in every aspect and layer of our bodies and the universe as a whole, and even our Earth, our planetary systems, our seasons. All of them follow something called the contraction and expansion period. But what people don't realize is there's a reset period. And this is where I think they lost themselves. The reset period is a period of equilibrium. Okay, and that you see that in the stock market. You see that in everything being waves and frequencies have to follow these periods, and you need that. The reset period is a period of transition. So in these reset periods, you're able to find particular areas where you could communicate information without state, where a state exists in what's called a superposition. And this is the idea of what zero and the role of zero. So zero as a role allows for this state of superposition because zero is not the absence. Zero as itself is not the absence of a particular number in the way you think it is. It's not nothing. Zero is a state of unlimitedness. And unlimitedness can seem like nothing because there's no exact form. So it's the idea that all numbers can be contained in zero, the same way all shapes can be contained in a sphere or a circle. And so when you understand this, you understand, so I can technically instantiate, am I using that word correctly? you can instantaneously create a state out of the role of zero if you know the properties that exist in the state you're trying to achieve. And so the same way, if you have a credit card that's unlimited on paper, like a black card, like a black Amex card, that you could afford to pay for anything because it doesn't necessarily have a certain amount that's sitting in your account. It's the idea that the credit allowed for this is covering any prices. There's nothing you can't buy with that, so to speak, because it's based on the idea that you have a credibility, which is your credit, that can cover the amount of anything because of how much you were making in your income annually, or you just have a certain amount that allows for this to happen in a contractual sort of existence, which is why you can't just go out and get it. You have to have earned that, and so how that exists in numerical logic is now you begin to see, okay, interesting. And you look at the Fibonacci sequence and like you see it starts off with 0, 1, 1, 2. Now I could do a whole video alone talking for hours about why that is and what that is. And then how 3 as the first prime number outside of 2 is 2 and 3 are both primes, but they're not the same sort of prime. And they're prime. And what is a prime? It's a structural node. There's so much I can get into what this is, and I wrote a lot of papers about it, and I have not released them because I feel like once this information is known, it's sort of like you understand the fabric of reality at a level that allows you to then, if you're intelligent and nefarious enough, you'd be able to then manipulate your own devices that could potentially be against other people who have no idea what that is. And I don't just want to give that to people. I don't want to just unload that, at least not now, not until there's safeguards, which is why I'm going the route I am of creating these safeguards so that people are protected. Which is why I'm, there's a whole thing here. which is why I'm making something called a Halo, which is going to make your computers faster. The next thing I want to make is a cybersecurity-based thing, which prevents you from being hacked, prevents people from monitoring your computers and your items, which also prevents people who, once this information is out there, they can't just dig right into your items. This is going to be something that's so much deeper than this is giving you that protection that you didn't even know was taken from you. But how I want this to affect, how it seems that this is the best way for this to affect the world, is that you then change the idea of what we think in terms of physics and energy conservation. You can reapproach what we thought was necessary. Even how we think about time, how time to us seems like there's a linear progression of past, present, and future, and not that the reality of it is that they all exist in superposition. And for your coherence, you can only access one, which is your current state of being and the current properties around you. But there's no real timeline per se, which is why it's able to be a constant, which is funny because you would think, well, that's contradictory, right? But if you download the mental scaffolding that all contradictions have to exist for them to be in reality, then that means that something that does exist also doesn't exist. And so, which is why it's allowed to exist. It'd be a hard pill to swallow, but it is real, and also not real, right? You get it once you have that downloaded, and so then you're able to look at, okay, you think that you have to go from A all the way through the alphabets to get to Z, right? But technically, you can go from you create words by putting different pieces of the alphabet together. You create numbers by putting different pieces together. They don't have to go. If I had to go if I wanted to have numbers come together, and I had to count from one to the end to the other to get to a certain amount, which in a way you do, but I can't explain all of it right now. But I would say, if let's say I have the number 3. What is the number 3 in terms of superposition? Well, it'd be 3. Let's say I had 3 dots on a paper that represents a positive state. I would also have to have 3 dots on a paper that represents a negative state, which is called a contraction period. So I would have an expansion-based period modules, like 3 dots on a paper that represent the possibility of something existing, which are existing. And then I would have 3 dots on the paper representing the possibility of not existing. And when you combine those two, they cancel each other out. Well, not entirely. They cancel each other out to 0.5. And if you know about the Riemann hypothesis, you'll know that 0.5 is the threshold of all real numbers, and that's kind of the reason why. And the non-trivial zeros are superposition states existing along the line that prime numbers exist, and which is why you see extra zeros. If you were to go along the line of the Fibonacci sequence and only just derive 0, +1, and -1, and follow that sequence along the entirety of it, prime numbers would only fall along the locations of 0 and +1 and never -1. So there's a clear distinction of position based on these periods, and this is I wrote this a lot in my papers as well. And so I'm saying this, which is very technical, and I'm sorry if I've lost you. I'm saying this to explain that you don't have to, a state transition does not have to be 1-to-1. For me to go, which also means that in the timeline, I don't have to go 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds into the future technically. For my coherence, in the sake of my being, I can only reduce it so much based in this state of being. That's the limitations I have. But that doesn't mean that the fabric of reality has to follow that necessarily. Now, there are some limitations, but you can do things that can get around that. And I think the biggest way you can start is by looking at what we use for energy in the first place. Like computers primarily rely on electrical energy because we're most familiar with it. About less than 100 years ago, Tesla introduced the idea of alternating current, which is a recursive strategy. It's the idea of it going around and around and around in a circle. Whereas you had direct current, which is the idea of a static principle. It's that you have one method of communicating the energy, whereas instead of having an alternating ability for it to oscillate. Principally, you need both. Once again, the contradiction of states. You'd have to have a direct current and an alternating current for these two to work together. And if interestingly enough, composite numbers are the idea of this sort of propagating principle that they ride the wave that energy from prime numbers and prime positions give. And where is this energy coming from? From zero. It's a triadic law. So I know this is a lot, but you also, it's the same reason that energy comes, you see pi, and pi's distribution of energy is always 3.14, right? It's a triadic law there. 4 coming from the vertical stacking of the number 2, which is the first prime number besides 3. And these two play a role together. I'm sorry if I'm losing you, because I know this is a lot to hear if you've never heard this before. I've proven all of this, by the way, mathematically speaking. If it wasn't true, it would completely fall apart. But all these knowledge has allowed me to build upon my approaches with creating software that alleviates the need for hardware. Because when you alleviate energy constraints that are posed from physical systems, like the limitations that I have in the physical body, and just rely on the information as a purity, you're able to do things that don't require the same constraints. When I can so you're sort of leaning on the idea that quantum entanglement exists, and the idea that you can because they're both existing in superposition, then one state communicates with the other based on the idea, like that hydrophobic, like that phospholipid bilayer that has two states have to repel the other in order for there to exist to be a spectrum of hot to cold, or whatever you want to call it, dark to light. Then when you are abiding by that rule, you're able to create information connection. You're able to allow for energy itself to be instantaneously communicated in the locations that don't require from a direct linear coherent line of getting from one side to the other. It's sort of like a teleportation in theory, in concept. And so I've explored all these avenues the last 10 months. And the one thing I want to do is to make this a bigger name, perhaps, is for one, starting with the software to do things that they thought was impossible, right? And this also fixes the problem with what they use with qubits, computational bits. Computational bits, they have these quantum computers that exist in superposition and are calculating operations, but they're also still using it in a brute force kind of way that's creating a lot of errors and also slowing it down massively. Whereas I've eliminated that entirely with my math, which is why, like places like Microsoft, I think that I honestly believe that the shackles that are causing them not to be able to see it are because they're leaning on the old principles that were given to them that were just explorations of thought, not hard and fast and ruled. Like Schrodinger's equation he knew the flaws of it. He wasn't saying take this and run with it and lean on it. He's saying here's an idea of something that exists and also doesn't exist simultaneously, and what does that mean for all states of being? And why does the wave function collapse when you observe it? Well, when you observe it, you now are creating a distinct location that now it gives it itself parameters. So when you create parameters around a being, that takes it from the idea of 0 to 1 through the observation. You have observed and communicated the information that property exists, and now you've created boundaries based on where it exists and doesn't exist. And so that makes it become discrete. Even if it's a large discrete location, it nevertheless has boundaries. Whereas 0 is the idea of a boundaryless boundary, which I wrote in a paper. And what is a boundaryless boundary? It's the idea that something has no boundaries, and therefore the boundaries are when something else that has a boundary meets infinity. That is the boundaryless boundary. The idea of when air touches, nothing reaches something. And 0 is being the idea of unlimited, can now consume all sizes and states into itself, into unlimited being, which is why any number you multiply by 0 is consumed by 0. It becomes unlimited. And then you can also have anything come from it when you add to it. I know this is a lot. Here's how I can see this. So if I bring this down to eye level and I say, okay, what does all this mean? I say, we use grids and electrical energy, and they're trying to establish light photonics. Let's skip past all of that and design a deterministic approach that energy and information is calculated one time, and then it's established forever, which is a 99.9999% reduction of energy costs and brute forcing, which means you could set up the entire grid of a town with basically no energy. You could create a car. If you want to use electrical energy, fine. It doesn't matter. If you want to use combustion energy, which I know the only reason that exists right now is because of the economic engine that exists with the current module that is energy and oil and all these things. Like, they're so far down that rabbit hole from the Industrial Revolution that to change that would cause a huge upheaval of problems. So you have to do this in a way that doesn't get in their way and also get me killed. that I can be an asset, that I can say, hey, let me call them my municipality. I live in a major city. Hey, can I offer this opportunity, this idea that I can, without even taking overhaul of hardware, I can produce a software that the main hub of your grid runs on, will calculate how much energy is needed one time, and the second time is instantaneous. This is what I've done with my software. You run the energy one time to calculate it, right? And the second time it's instantaneous because it has all the things, all the information is compressed, and you're able to accomplish all of this, And I could even do it without needing to do the one time, but I think it's better to do it the one time, and I could get into that later. But this opens the way for energy conservation in a way that we've never seen it before, and I think that this is the future, and this is going to open up an entire new sphere of things if they allow it to. I don't think there's enough time. I don't think they will. Not now. I mean, we have a few years before there's a lot of overhaul, and even less than that before, the current social atmosphere has changed drastically. So I don't think I'll see it while I'm here on the earth, but I think at the very least I could start opening the seeds to it. And so much of what I know they can already do, like DARPA or whatever. They know a lot about it, but I don't know how much they know. I don't know the extent of it. I don't even know if they realize that they could technically use it for medicine. Like, I could reverse engineer your cells to a degree that you can, if you apply these frameworks, you'd be able to heal just about anything you can think of. I could reverse your cells. I could reverse your cell. I don't want to get too deep into that. I've done a lot of research on that and a lot of tests and not just with like large language models. I know everyone's skeptical about AI because of hallucination. It's not that. This is so much deeper than that. There's so much far beyond that. But there's a lot here at our disposal, and that's why you won't understand now. But in a few years, if this happens, if all these things become unveiled, you will understand why I've been so hesitant and what it all means. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope we can move forward together. If you have any questions, if you want to be a part of this in some aspect, I am weary about collaborations, but there are ways that we could probably open one door or the other for each other. So if you're to the tens of you who are watching this. Anyway, thanks for watching, and take care.